The April 30, 2020 meeting of the Williamsburg City Council will come to order. Ms. Felico, would you call the roll, please? Ms. Felico?
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Mr. Maslin?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Freiling?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Here.
Mr. Zhang?
Here.
Before we get on to today's business, I just wanted to let the community know that today is the last day for City of Williamsburg's Public Information Officer, Leanne Hartman. Leanne has worked closely with council over the past few years. She's taken innumerable photos of us that always seem to take a long time to execute. And she seems to enjoy watching us stand there for her to push the shutter button. She's done some great work on an internal city newsletter, on a monthly newsletter that's distributed to the community. She's done some terrific work in the staffing of the EOC and was recently praised for her efforts in that regard. And I think it's notable the amount of effort that she's put forward these last 5-6 weeks. Gosh, is that all it is? It seems like months. We've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Leanne's had a hand in every one of those city communications on behalf of council. So we will be sorry to see Leanne go, but we wish her the best in retirement. Any of my colleagues have anything they'd like to add?
I would certainly echo that. Leanne has been there on the forefront of all of this and has done an outstanding job, and she'll sorely be missed.
Leanne has been an incredible PIO for the city, and we'll miss her, but we wish her well. And I'll never forget, as she had said, this lanky college kid stopping by her office before my election to city council and talking to me about all things about the city. So thank you, Leanne, if you're tuning in, and we wish you well.
So I would like to also wish Leanne all the best in her retirement. And in addition to the pictures, I remember one of the amazing race days running around in a golf cart, taking pictures of all of the contestants. And especially appreciate her efforts on the city monthly newsletter.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Leanne also, and especially for her work on the National Night Out Committee. And I'm glad to hear that she will actually continue on that committee.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. And again, thank you, Leanne. We have several items that we will be dealing with today, one of which has a public hearing and some that do not. So in case there's anybody who would like to comment on any of the items that we will be addressing for which we do not have a public hearing, those are the 3 items under new business. We'd welcome that comment now. Did we happen to receive anything in advance?
Mayor, we did receive a couple of comments through the online system, both emails, I think, and or one was an email to the virtual city council email address, and the other one came in through our publicinput.com portal. And I believe the clerk is prepared to read those into the record.
And they're related to today's business?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ms. Felico, would you be able to read those for us?
Yes, sir. The first one is from Dean Beller. His comments read, if nothing else, I recommend you place a cap on the amount any business can receive under this recommendation. The Commissioner of Revenue should be able to provide information on this. I would expect that the EDA has already been provided that information as part of their due diligence on making this recommendation. Secondly, there should be consideration of a cap on the total amount any one corporation can receive. My concern is that, number one, large corporations will be in a better position to apply for these first come, first served grants, while smaller companies, the moms and pops, not accustomed to receiving grants, will not be as prepared. I note that no information is provided on the EDA grant process. Number two, similarly, the City Council should be concerned that no one large corporation or corporations with multiple sub-business with their own license tax be able to advantage of this program to the detriment of many other smaller one-site, one business tax small businesses. such as Marriott's, Colonial Williamsburg, etc. With regards to the transfer of funds from the TDF to the general fund, it would have been beneficial for the public, if not the city council as well, to understand the fiscal impact to the FY 2019 budget. I noted there was no information on the curtailment of expenditures, actions to stem costs to this year's budget, such as a freeze on hiring and expenditures. That lack of information appears to present the city council as being with a slush fund that artificially solves its problem. In the future, I will look forward to seeing the grants awarded by the EDA and the amount, along with the information on the city's expense reduction process. That concludes his remarks.
Ms. Belico, do you have any other?
I do. I have one from David Crambiel. His remarks read as follows. Businesses only open for a few months in 2019 are in the worst shape and have the greatest need for help, yet they qualify for the smallest amounts. We should have a cap value that any business can ask for, perhaps 100,000, maybe 50,000 if that is too high. Help those in most need and to not focus on the largest grants going to those with highest revenue in 2019. And that concludes his remarks.
And I believe we have a caller on the line who would like to comment.
Actually, sir, the caller just dropped off.
Okay, I'm sorry, we just lost the caller. No, there's no other previously submitted comments, correct?
That is all that I have received.
Okay, then we will move on to today's business. The first item is a public hearing to consider adoption of Resolution 20-09, authorizing an application for Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, Virginia funding opportunities for COVID-19 response. Ms. DeWitt, will you be presenting on this?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and members of council. The State Department of Housing and Community Development controls the CDBG funding and has opened up funding that they have available now, even prior to the CARES Act, for communities to compete for, to use for health and economic impacts related to COVID-19. These funds need to serve our low to moderate income population. And we, staff, discussed this thoroughly with the state agency and propose that we submit an application for 4 things. The first 3 we have flushed out with the state staff specifically. The 4th one, they're not sure how they're going to work on that yet, but they asked us to please speak to it and have a public hearing, have it included in the public hearing. The first one is to provide emergency housing and 3 meals a day for our unsheltered and homeless population. The second one is to provide emergency rental assistance for individuals and families who are temporarily residing in motels and are at the risk of homelessness due to a reduction in income. The third is to purchase produce and unprepared food to deliver to low to moderate income populations. And the 4th one that the state is not sure how to do yet, but wants to keep talking to us, would be around job retention and small business relief. So we're including that one. We don't know how that will work, but we'll continue to work with the state on it. I will note that the city is already providing these services to our low to moderate income populations who've been affected by COVID-19, and the state has agreed that we will be reimbursed for the efforts we've done starting mid-March to now, as well as this request is to continue that funding through June 30th. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Could somebody, Mr. Trivette or Ms. DeWitt, speak a little bit about the process here, because it's a little bit different than many other programs that we deal with?
Yes, so the process is, the state is streamlining the process the best that they can. CDBG funds come from HUD, they are federal funds, and applying for these funds for localities, well, let me back up. There are 2 separate groups of localities in Virginia. Larger localities receive CDBG funding directly from HUD. It goes through the state, but they get it directly as an entitlement based on their population. and their need. We are considered a non-entitlement community because of our population size being small. We do not receive direct annual CDBG funds. We have to apply to compete with them. And the majority of Virginia localities have to do that. It's a highly competitive process, takes months, if not years of effort to apply for a grant. And typically the grants are of $1 million or more. Due to COVID-19 situation, the state is making it much more streamlined to apply for these funds. And as you'll see, for the first 3 categories I mentioned around emergency housing, rental assistance, and groceries and food, our ask is about $160,000. So they've streamlined it, but one of the requirements still in place is that we hold 2 public hearings. Today is the first of those public hearings, which is where we identify what staff has said the need is and receive public input on that. We'll be allowed to apply for the application after this action by City Council, and then hold a second public hearing that's required at your next meeting about the details of our application. So that's not typical. Typically, it's a much longer process.
Great, thank you, Ms. DeWitt. Any questions for Ms. DeWitt?
Just thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just some clarity. So we're applying for funds in the future so that we can distribute it as you've outlined. But you also said that the state has agreed to reimburse us for previous efforts that we made. Should we be expecting funds, or is it 2 different applications or 2 different agreements that we're seeking, or is it all one? Meaning, have they agreed and we know that those funds are coming?
I wish I could answer that. I have a high optimism that they will be, Mr. Pons, but we cannot know for sure until the application goes in and we hear officially from the governor's office. But all signs and all indications at the staff level is that these will be received. Okay,
so they've agreed to consider
That's
the
right.
previous effort fund. You gotcha. Okay, thank you.
I think the other thing to note there, Mr. Pons, is that the timing of the actual funding coming to us will likely be 100% reimbursement, as opposed to front funding some effort.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Witt, for the presentation and for being proactive in putting this application together. I think it is also worth noting that I believe Ms. Wendy Evans also had a role to play. But if I just wanted to provide my thanks for all of the staff involved with this extensive process. Michele, you had mentioned in the agenda summary and in your presentation that a nonprofit entity that are currently doing one of the 3 I guess priorities that are outlined with this grant application may be reimbursed. I see that this might be a little nitpicky, but in the agenda item, it says a nonprofit entity. So is there only one out of a pool of them that will receive this, or is this going to be divvied up accordingly to any organization that seeks to apply for this?
It will be the former, Mr. Zhang. House of Mercy is the identified nonprofit. They are already providing these services in the city, so they would continue. The one difference there would be that this grant would allow us to have administrative costs to have a staff person on site at the homeless emergency non-congregate housing option.
Thank you.
And the only question that I had is I noticed that this amount is for $165,000 through June 30th. If we see the need after that date, is there an opportunity to go back in for an additional grant?
Great question, Ms. Ramsey. Yes, there is. And through the CARES Act, more funding should come down through this pipeline. Right now, they're using the funds that they have available in the current fiscal year, but they will be receiving more funds and will be having more discussions with us about how to use them to address the COVID-19 impacts. And I'm optimistic that they will want to continue to help us here with these funds.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for putting the application together. And I think you've mentioned that other cities get these types of funds on a regular basis. Now that we're going through this process, can you see in the future we might be requesting on a semi-regular basis, maybe more limited funds for these types of efforts?
Good question, Mr. Maslin. I'm not sure what the future will hold in terms of applying as a non-entitlement community for those competitive funds. In the past, it's been a quite large undertaking. As I mentioned, takes a year plus to do it. And usually you do not apply for those unless there's $1 million or more in need. But it's always great that we are keeping these relationships with the state and keep talking to them. We've reminded them how high we are on the vulnerability index in this COVID-19 impact because of our hospitality, largeness of the hospitality in our economic sector. So they're very aware of that, but I can't predict whether they'll go back to the old model or they will do a different thing going forward.
Well, also, do we know whether the counties are also pursuing this funding?
We know that James City County is also in talks with DHCD, and we talked to them to make sure that we are not competing against each other. Also, Wendy Evans, our Human Services Director, had many conversations with our regional COC, who provides these emergency housing opportunities for everyone on the peninsula, to make sure we were not competing or taking away any funding from them. And we have been assured that we are not. There will be no duplication of effort, and this will not hurt anyone else's chances to apply for these funds.
Thank you.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, I will go ahead and open the public hearing. Mr. Trivette or Ms. Felico, did we receive any comments in advance specifically related to this agenda item?
I have no other items.
Okay, and we do not have anybody on the line waiting to speak. We'll give it just another second or two in case somebody's calling in. Okay, well, hearing none, we'll come back to council for discussion. Action.
I just echo everybody's sentiment. I think it's a great opportunity, and certainly applaud the staff for taking the initiative to find these funds that could be available to support those people in the greatest need. So thank you.
Just wanted to extend my appreciation again to staff for compiling all the necessary info for this extensive process. Also thank the Commonwealth for allowing non-entitlements localities such as us to be able to access these funds. So I'll be supporting the motion.
And I'll be supporting the motion as well for the same reasons.
I agree.
So I'll move that City Council approve resolution number 20-09 as drafted.
Second.
Ms. Felico, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Freiling,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Zhang.
Aye.
So we will, staff will be working on the application, and then we will talk about this at our next meeting. And that would be the Thursday meeting, not the Monday work session.
That's right.
Next item, which is the first item under new business, is consideration and adoption of resolution 20-07, reserving local unspent sales tax receipts currently designated for the Tourism Development Grant Fund to be used for ongoing city operations and grant programs established by the City Council for the purpose of COVID-19 financial impact relief. Mr. Trivette, will you be presenting here?
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Resolution 2007 is really, at this point, sort of a housekeeping issue. As you remember, our last virtual City Council meeting, I made a presentation to you concerning how we would be adjusting our budget forecast, both for FY20 and FY21, as a result of expected impacts from COVID-19 mitigation measures. And both scenarios for both fiscal years included relying on the unspent balances of the Tourism Development Grant Program to help us cover shortfalls that are expected at the end of the year. So what this resolution does is it allows us to take that step for FY20. We will need to do a similar resolution at the close of FY21 if it proves to be necessary. So what this resolution does specifically for FY20 is it frees up the balance of the unspent money in the Tourism Development Grant Fund for use by the city to cover the deficits at the end of the year, and also offer any grant programs the city council may see fit, which pertains to another item on today's agenda.
Questions for Mr. Trivette?
No questions.
And to clarify, Mr. Trivette, thank you for your presentation. This is, like you said, conforming with the budget strategy that you and staff had outlined in the last virtual meeting about future budgetary directions of what the city can do, and rather than solely rely on the reserve funds for taking action to mitigate, using as much of the reserve funds as possible. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, staff feels that the reserve fund is going to be critically important to carry us through FY21, and there's a much greater reliance on the balance that's there. And so we felt like it was important to protect it for as long as we can. In addition to that, we don't know what next emergency might be waiting in the wings.
Right.
We are about to enter hurricane season. We're in a hurricane-prone zone, and there could be expenses the city incurs as a result of that, including more business closures. So the reserve is going to continue to be that safety cushion that allows the city to continue to operate at the level that the citizens expect.
And I would really just encourage any folks that are tuning in today, if you're not sure where this is coming from, we've had extensive directions and conversations and presentations in the last virtual meeting, which is online. But again, I think you captured the point eloquently, Mr. Trivette. Appreciate your due diligence. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So I don't have any questions, just to reiterate that, as Mr. Trivette said, it's a housekeeping thing. It's basically unlocking the gate that around the TDF funds and making them available and eligible for other uses by the city. So I'm fine.
No questions.
Mr. Trivette, if I may, I think I'm interpreting the email correctly that was read at the beginning of the meeting, that the Mr. Belair, who submitted that, did not have information on what our fiscal year 19 operating deficit was projected to be, which I believe we discussed at our last meeting, and it's part of your budget information that you've shared. Would you mind just running through those two numbers, what we anticipate the deficit to be for 19 and again for, I'm sorry, I should say fiscal year 20, and again for 21?
Sure, I can. Let me just pull up that information. One correction, though, is that I think that Mr. Belair's comment, it said FY19, but I think that he was actually referring to FY20.
Yeah, I believe so too. That's fine.
Because there were no deficits in FY19. We finished the year with a surplus. But in FY20, we are expecting a deficit of as much as $4.2 million. And I am going to be going over the same presentation that I gave to you previously in a much more brief format in the next item on the agenda. But just to summarize, that 4.2 projection for the end of FY20 is based on some worst case scenarios becoming reality. And Ms. Dameron and I were talking earlier today about how we will report to council moving forward on where we are relative to those projections that we made in terms of worst case scenarios. And what we can already tell you is that we finished March and April stronger than those projections. So the estimate of 4.2 is going to be higher than what we will likely finish. Now, it is possible that the projections for the rest of the year are worse, but that seems unlikely. So just keep in mind that we try to be very conservative in these worst case scenarios. And so those numbers are quite large. Ultimately, it is our hope that we finish both fiscal years, FY20 and FY21, with a much lower deficit, if any at all, that would allow us not to transfer as much or none from both the reserve and the Tourism Development Grant Program.
And if we did not undertake this transfer from the TDF, we would have to deplete our reserve fund by whatever amount we eventually do take out of the Tourism Development Fund. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. The other point I just want to make, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the language in the Senate bill does not create any restriction on the way the city uses the money that we are talking about here. The city created its own policy on how that money was to be handled. A very different time, very different circumstances. We're now realizing the impact. Well, we've realized it for some time. We're dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by taking this money that the city had determined it would previously allocate to tourism infrastructure and using it to fund some basic operations and potentially a business grant. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So I just want to make it clear, we're not doing anything here that is in any way out of line with what the state dictated we could or should do. Any discussion?
If I may, I just wanted to also add, clearly we're faced with some extenuating circumstances with the effects of COVID that it's had on our families, but as it pertains to this conversation, our economy. Revenue is declining, and we're all grappling with ways to make up those shortcomings. And so, for the city to take on this endeavor of using Tourism Development Fund is not something that we take lightly. We created that fund for a purpose, as you pointed out, Mr. Mayor, that we wanted to use it for tourism infrastructure. I think we all agree that is still our desire to fulfill that wish of building some infrastructure to diversify our tourism economy. And once this is behind us, we're going to get back to that as an agenda item. The fund is not going away, just the funds in it. And then it will be our intention to, as the economy turns around and the needs of the municipality start to level off in terms of its requirement to deplete our rainy day fund and our tourism fund, that the Tourism Development Fund will be starting to accumulate money again in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Anybody else like to comment on this or any discussion? If not, is there a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move that the City Council adopt Resolution 20-07 as drafted.
Second.
Okay.
Ms. Felica, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Freiling,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Zhang.
Aye.
That takes us to our second item under new business, which is consideration and adoption of Resolution 20-08, establishing the City of Williamsburg COVID-19 Business Grant Program with $1 million in available funds. Mr. Trivette, will you be presenting here?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. So the council asked us to consider ways in which we could provide relief to the businesses of Williamsburg that direly need it. As their revenues have been impacted, some have even been forced to close as a result of COVID-19 mitigation measures. So as we sat down to do that, the council suggested that we consider using some of the funding that's available through the Tourism Development Grant Fund to provide that relief. So what we did is we constructed a very simple program because we felt like at the staff level, simplicity was what was needed. I think that right now everyone has enough on their hands without a complex grant application process and criteria for screening who's eligible and who's not. So we sat down really with that tenet in mind, that we wanted it to be simple and we wanted it to be very open in terms of application. So we talked through all the different ways in which mechanically we could provide that relief. And ultimately what we decided on is to create a grant program that enables a defined set of locally owned businesses that are current on their taxes to date to apply for a grant. And the grant would be issued through the EDA, and the grant value would be approximately 50% of their BPOL that was paid in 2019. There are two sets of criteria that are, again, very, very simple. The first is general criteria. And as I said, that they include things like being locally owned. You've got to be located inside the city of Williamsburg. So very simple tests to pass. And then the second one are loss criteria. And this is where it gets a little bit more stringent, but still very open. There are two loss criteria application parameters. Number one is that you were forced to close by the governor's executive order number 53. That automatically qualifies you to apply. And then the second one is your business was substantially impacted by the mitigation requirements for COVID-19. And in either scenario, you can apply. We're going to open the grant period, I believe, by next week. I'm sorry, May the 4th, and it will run through the beginning of June. The intent is to make all of the grant awards by the end of the month of August. So a very quick turnaround in terms of application and payout. A couple of other things of note beyond the grant qualification is how to fund the grant program. So as I said a moment ago, what I'd like to do is just take a minute and turn back to the presentation that I gave to council at the last virtual meeting regarding our budget strategies for mitigating the impacts to our budget from COVID-19. So to do that, what I have done is I have simply gone back to the presentation that I gave at that meeting and updated it to reflect the change of a lower balance in the Tourism Development Grant Program that would be available to help offset deficits at the end of the fiscal year. So I won't give the whole presentation again, but I'll just run through it quickly. As I said earlier, this was based on a series of worst case scenario assumptions that produced deficits for both FY20 and FY21. In FY20, you can see here our forecast of 4.2 as a potential deficit. So the way in which that we propose to cover that deficit is to reduce spending in the CIP and capture savings from projects that were already completed that came in under budget, to capture money from the Tourism Development Fund that was unspent in the grant program, and to rely on the reserve to make up the difference that's left. So if we allocate $1 million from the Tourism Development Grant Program to the purpose of this grant, this business relief grant, then what it does is essentially shifts $1 million of burden from the Tourism Fund to the Reserve Fund. And you can see there how it impacts. It's very simple. It's $1 million from column A goes to column B. The impact of that is shown on the next slide, which shows you the projections that we gave for end of the fiscal year fund balances under some different scenarios. So the first bar, FY20 General Fund Reserve Current, shows you what the balance of the General Fund Reserve would be if we didn't do anything to mitigate the deficits. And we simply used the reserve to cover those shortfalls at the end of the year. And then the second column is the reserve strategy. So if we followed Plan A, which was to use a combination of CIP, Tourism Development Fund, and the reserve to a minor extent in FY20, the balance there would be $14 million in the General Fund Reserve, or 43% of the operating revenue, which corresponds to the City Council's reserve policy that requires us to maintain 35% there. If we do the grant program that's proposed, then it would lower the reserve grant at the end of FY20 by $1 million and take that fund balance to 40%. And that's just simply adding the $1 million grant to the mix. So I'm going to move through these slides and get to FY21. This is the same slide showing you the projected deficit as a result of the worst case scenario, 6.5. That produces a total deficit over the two fiscal years of $10.7 million. The strategy is unchanged because there's no grant program proposed for FY21. But on the next slide, you can see the impact of doing the business grant carries forward to FY21. So same order of bars here, you've got the reserve current, which represents if we did nothing in FY20 and in FY21 to offset the deficits and simply relied on the reserve to make up the shortfalls. The next bar is what would happen if we followed the strategy that we unveiled at the last virtual meeting. And then this bar shows you what the balances would be if we offered that business grant in FY20. Essentially, it lowers that reserve balance by $1 million. It does take us under the 35% requirement in FY21, but I think that's going to be okay. And the reason I think that is because, as I said before, the worst case scenarios are very conservative. Even as we put them together, Ms. Dameron and I agreed that they were unlikely to become reality. But we wanted to be as conservative as we could be so that we weren't surprised by lower than expected numbers at the end of the fiscal years. In addition to that, the worst case scenarios do not factor in any relief at all that the city might receive from the federal government or the state government as a result of COVID-19. And we anticipate that some relief will come. And then the third thing is that these scenarios also include, and the original budget proposed by the school board stays intact. And that seems very unlikely. What we know is that the sales tax revenue that we pass on to the school system will be reduced and result in reduced operating expenses for the school system out of necessity. We also can expect that James City County will request a budget amendment from the school system as they begin to grapple with the impacts of COVID-19 on their budget. As you know, we are a 10% funding partner, roughly 10% funding partner in the joint school system. And our budget typically is completed first, and then we adjust it based on what actually gets adopted by James City County and the corresponding budget for the school system. So I think that when we consider those three things, the fact that they're conservative, this is a very conservative forecast. We don't know what federal or state aid might come, and we don't know yet what the reductions in our share of costs for the joint school system will be. It's very likely that even with the $1 million grant, we will finish FY21 above the 35% threshold required by the City Council's policy. However, if the worst case becomes reality, even being below the 35%, 32% is still a very healthy balance for a reserve in any locality. And while we want to work hard to replenish that reserve amount, if we should have to go to that level, I don't think it will be difficult in future years. With that, Mayor, I'm happy to take any questions, as well as Ms. DeWitt or Ms. Stammerin, who are also available.
Questions for Mr. Trivette or any other staff?
Just some technical clarity, if I could. So what we're saying is that businesses that paid their B poll tax in 2019 are eligible. And when we say that, and maybe I need a refresher on when those B poll taxes are due. As I recall, sometimes toward the end of the year, beginning of the new year, businesses get the form from the Commissioner of Revenue asking to estimate what their future year's revenue will be. And based on that, they pay a B poll tax. Is that not correct, or?
So I will answer first, and then if I need correction, Ms. Dameron is on the phone or on the line as well. But what I would say is, yes, B poll is paid once a year. And it's an estimate of what your tax will be at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, there's a true up period where you make it correct to what your actual receipts are. And all of that is handled by the Commissioner of the Revenue. And all of that information is protected from view by general city staff, including the finance department. So our grant program will rely heavily on the Commissioner of Revenue to help us verify eligibility in terms of taxes paid and also the amount that's due.
Okay, so that would put the timing of the invoice or the first request of information from the Commissioner of Revenue towards the end of 2019, so that then there's time to have the information go back and forth, and then a true up, and then the payments usually come the following year. For example, so all of 2019, those taxes have probably been paid sometime in February, March. For those
taxes are due for the March 1st. So they would have been due March 1st of 2020.
Okay. So in this case, any business that existed in 2019 is eligible for a portion of their B poll tax in the form of a grant for this program.
Great.
Yeah.
That's right. Meeting all of the other criteria, of course.
Right. Okay. I think that's all the only questions. I have a couple comments, but I'll reserve them until after the questions.
Mr. Zhang, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Trivette, excellent presentation. I think you clearly outlined how this grant program would affect our budgetary strategies from the last sessions. Appreciate that. I think it also cannot be understated how grateful we are in terms of having our fiscal policies and being able to even deliberate on a program such as this without putting us in the red or without sacrificing some sort of operational duty. My first question, and this might be technical again, but how do food trucks come into play with this? I know there are none that physically located in the city at all times, although they are by right, I guess, allowed in the capital landing district. But I recall we do have food trucks that, would participate in second Sundays or other special events. Is that considered a physical footprint? Could they be eligible for the grant?
I think yes. I think if they have a current business license and are current on all of their taxes that are applicable, then they would be eligible to apply.
Right. And
assuming that they can meet all of the criteria. I mean, we're speaking generally about eligibility, but there is a list of criteria that have to be met.
Right. And my understanding of it, and obviously I could be corrected with this, is that certain businesses such as food trucks would be subject to BPOL tax within the jurisdictions that they have footprints in accordance with the General Assembly. So that just kind of sparked that question. And I'm not sure if there are any other businesses out there that are similar in terms of the BPOL setup and classification as food trucks, but that's just something I was curious about. And something to clarify is that the city, we don't have information of the BPOL and of what businesses have. That's actually the Commissioner of Revenue, which is the constitutionally elected official. So how does that work?
So if I understand your question correctly, we have provided the outline of the grant program that you're looking at today to the Commissioner of the Revenue and asked for her comments. We did make some changes based on those, most of them technical in nature, both to the document itself in terms of the policy, but also to sort of frame up how the application process would work on the back end. We're very grateful for her help and assistance, but I do think the grant program will require her to help us coordinate not only eligibility, but also how much the award should be.
So if you have an applicant who may have overstated or understated perhaps what it is, that's something that you and staff are able to align with the Commissioner of Revenue and her duties, and she has access to that info to be able to ascertain the validity of that.
Right. There are some limitations to what we are able to verify, but for the most part, we will be able to check the meat of the application for accuracy.
Thank you. That's all questions I have. I have one general observation, but like the Vice Mayor, I'll reserve that for after. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And I just have a couple questions as well, as I just wanted to review a little bit of the process so that just to understand that the application will come forward through to the EDA, and I believe they will make the review. And when we say 50% of the BPOL, is there opportunities for them to review and say perhaps not up to 50%, or that they would feel that some businesses might not qualify for any amount as well?
So I'll start the answer and then I'll turn it over to Ms. DeWitt. But Ms. DeWitt and her staff have already been working through and have largely developed an application process that will be done online, very similar to how we handle the tourism development grant applications using that same system. So we're trying to make it as easy and as accessible as we can. Ultimately, what you're doing today is providing both funding and a policy document to the Economic Development Authority and asking them to administer the grant for you. So yes, the EDA will be involved in making those decisions. Ms. DeWitt, do you want to share a little bit more?
That's exactly right. We're using an online system called apply.com. The other piece of that, it allows us to loop in the Commissioner of the Revenue and the Finance Department to receive notifications throughout the grant review process, to receive those notifications electronically and do their review that way. So it's a very sophisticated program that we have, and we're excited. We rolled it out, of course, with the Tourism Development Fund grants and also with our $500 COVID marketing grant that we rolled out about a month ago, and it's been working well. I think your other question was whether a business could request less than 50% or not request a reimbursement. They certainly do not have to apply if they feel like they don't need these funds. So they must apply before they receive them. And certainly if they want less than 50%, we can work with them on that.
I wouldn't imagine that would be the case, but just want to cover all options. And just to reiterate, this grant program is based on the taxes that the businesses paid in themselves. It's not using taxpayer funds, or it's not coming from another type of tax revenue. Is that correct?
Correct. It's coming from a B-poll tax, which is a tax that the business pays based on a percentage of their gross receipts. So it is not a flow-through tax like a sales tax or a meals tax that the customers are paying. This is actually a business license tax that the business themselves have as an expense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Two questions. During the beginning of the council meeting, there was the question about whether the small businesses would be at a disadvantage. And I think this program, unlike what we've seen on the national scene, has enough money in it so that if every qualified business applies for the 50%, the funding is there. And that although we say time is of the essence, we don't think anybody would be not able to get their funding if they apply in a timely manner. Is that correct?
We think that it's unlikely, Mr. Maslin. I mean, it's very difficult to be certain, but we think that that's unlikely. We think there will be enough money for everyone who applies to be rewarded. Well, I should say everyone who applies, qualifies, and is determined to receive a grant will be able to do so.
And if we realize that the estimated $1 million was based on, the B-poll taxes being paid by all the businesses, some of which may not be qualified, that sort of hedges the funding a little bit, because we know that we've got certain businesses in Williamsburg that are national or corporate businesses that would not qualify for this. The second thing is our previous discussion about if there's money left over from the $1 million, would we be able to repurpose that for nonprofits, our local nonprofits? And could you just confirm that in our previous resolution, we sort of enabled that as a future possible action?
Yes, sir, that's right. So the former resolution does include nonprofits as a potential beneficiary of whatever might be done with tourism development grant fund monies that were unspent in FY20. And the way that we have set up the policy document is it returns unspent funds to the Tourism Development Fund. So there's no mechanism in this policy that would allow for that would set up a process where the council is transferring that money automatically to another grant program. We would need to come back and put something in place, another policy document that would allow that to happen. So we would have to work through crafting what that mechanism is.
Thank you.
So in essence, that would be a discussion for another day should we find ourselves in that position. Just to touch on Mr. Maslin's points, I think it's really worth emphasizing that this program cannot be compared with the federal programs because on the federal stage, there was no ability, I think at that point, to determine what the overall national need was going to be. And certainly they knew they couldn't meet it. And that's why they had a real first come, first serve process. We have first come, first serve in that the sooner you get your application in, the sooner it gets processed. But we have enough funding in the program to cover the entire amount should every business in this community apply for and be eligible for it. Again, as Mr. Maslin said, we know some will not be eligible for it. And even there may also be some businesses who are doing well enough. It seems hard to believe, but it's true that some are doing okay in this financial situation. And they won't qualify from the 50% decrease in business standpoint. So each business then does have a cap on the amount that they can receive because it's 50% of what they paid in B-poll. And we have a cap on the entire program, but it's still adequate to meet the entire needs of this once it's implemented. Is that correct, Mr. Trivette?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, I don't like to give categorical statements, but I think it's very likely that we will have enough to meet the need. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, when we know how much we collected in B-poll, we know how much we're putting into it. So if we're putting in just over half, there should not be any problem. I just would like to say two
Sorry to interrupt, but it's just under half. We know B-poll tax collection is 1.9 million. Oh, yes, you're right. I'm sorry.
Right, so we put in just over half of that.
That's right.
So,
Sorry about that.
just two other comments I'd like to make and then come back to my colleagues for theirs. I'd like to thank Commissioner of the Revenue, Laura Overy, for her help here in working with staff on the policy, but also the work that she and her team will be doing to help us in the implementation here. And I can imagine that there'll be some people who wonder, well, gosh, why are you giving this money back to businesses? What about the people in this community who are in need? What about the people who are maybe furloughed or out of a job? Well, the reason we're doing it for the businesses is because once we start to come out of the restricted time period, we need those businesses to be in place to hire people back, to give people more hours, to allow them to work and contribute to the community and also to their families. And we also know how precarious some of those businesses are right now. So it's we're doing what we can. We will try to do more if it's possible, as Mr. Maslin suggested. But this isn't even. This is one of many steps that we've been taking to try to mitigate the impact of the economic downturn or the economic outfall of this health issue. So I just thank staff and my colleagues for cooperation here and everybody working together to make this possible. Mr. Pons?
Thank you. I just wanted to go back real quick. Well, two more questions, if I may. How are we going to communicate this to the businesses? Is that via mail, email, phone call? And what do you expect the turnaround time is between the application, the EDA meeting, and the businesses receiving a check?
I think those are both questions best answered by Mr. Witt.
So the EDA is scheduled to meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. So they will be considering whatever action you take today to launch this program. And then my staff, we are ready to launch the online application Monday. So that's how that process will start. We have email addresses for most businesses in the city. So we will do a announcement of the grant program that way. We will also hope that the press covers it as well. Then we'll need to work with the Commissioner of the Revenue's office to see who has not applied based on her records, and how we will reach out those who don't apply as we approach the deadline of June 1st. And we're open to phone calls and also postcard mailings to do that, but that has not been determined yet.
Okay. Well, certainly, I'm sure you'll exhaust every resource to get out there and local business associations and what have you to try to communicate that, because it would seem to me that any business that would want to apply for this. Another question just occurred to me. The amount of revenue that a business takes in is closely held information. And to the extent that we can protect that information through this program, I think we should. And as we talk about that, when I say that out loud, it almost can't be public information how much grant money goes to any particular business, because in a sense, then we're divulging what they took in gross revenue. Is that a fair statement?
Right. That's right. That's right, Mr. Pond. So what we're going to do is, we can certainly publish which businesses applied and received grants. We won't be able to disclose the amounts. And in fact, the staff themselves will be protected from knowing the amounts outside of the Commissioner of Revenue and the Finance Department to the extent that they're eligible.
Okay. So that means the EDA wouldn't have any opportunity to, the members of the EDA who are volunteer residents won't have that information either. And they therefore won't also have the discretion to say, well, this business gets a little bit more, a little bit less. It is strictly based on the percentage of B-poll, the 50% of B-poll.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay. So I'm very supportive of this program, as you all know collectively, because I think I've talked to most of you about this program and certainly brought it up at the last city council meeting. And the mayor spoke to it earlier. These businesses, some more than others, are really struggling. struggling with cash flow, employment, and grappling with, do they even open up again? And for some, this grant may not make that difference. I hope it does. But as we launch into the spring season in the service industry that we have, the tourism industry have, businesses are very dependent upon having some cash flow. And so I think this will help them some, it may just be a drop in the bucket, but at this point, I believe every little bit counts. And so I commend my fellow council members for, along with me, getting behind this program, because I think it goes a long way. The businesses that I've spoken to have all been very receptive. In fact, while I was sitting here, I got a communication from a restaurateur that applauds all of your efforts in supporting this endeavor, and looks forward to being an applicant. So I look forward to supporting it, and thank you again, everybody that's worked on this.
I wanted to echo my appreciation, Mayor's appreciation to Laura Overy, Commissioner for Revenue, on work on her partnership with this, and also to the rest of city staff for developing this innovative policy option. Again, to the Mayor's point, this is just one of many tools that the city government is going to have to leverage when things go back to normal. But I do support the motion. One other general observation in terms of the whole fiscal picture that we're looking at, alluding to my first point, is we're in a really good position. And based on the presentation, I'm even looking on page 9, even for FY21, if we dip into the reserves with this great opportunity, yes, we want to meet the 35% threshold, but even then, I'm looking at page 9 of the presentation with the Moody's Investment Service suggesting that fund balances average about 30% of revenues. We still exceed that expectation. We're still in a great fiscal position that will allow us to continue with the resilience this city has so far endured throughout this this COVID-19. And to reiterate, I think based on this, this is the worst case scenario. And I think in my conversations with you, Drew, and I'm sure along with the rest of my colleagues here, it should be better projected than what we have here. So it should not cause alarm. And I agree wholeheartedly with the Vice Mayor's comments. This will help preserve and provide that much needed cash flow to our businesses. And I just wanted to wrap up by thanking all the business owners who have reached out, and certainly those that I've reached out for comment and feedback on this. I support this resolution. Thank you.
And I too support the resolution, and I recognize that no program is going to be perfect, but I really feel that we need to help our businesses in a meaningful way sooner rather than later. And as Drew said, this is an easy way, something as far as formulation of the program, and a way that we can make immediate action. And I think it also gives grants back to the businesses part of what they have put into the city coffers, and it does not take from the resident taxpayers. And part of my support comes from an editorial in the local Scoop magazine that I found while I was cleaning out some of my papers, as one does when you're home a lot. And not to take up too much time, but I just wanted to read a few comments that were here because I think they're very pertinent to what we're trying to do. And a couple things he said was, it's an exciting time to live in Williamsburg. We've seen new businesses open, existing businesses grow and expand, spirit of kindness fanned into flame, a renewed energy and excitement about what's happening in Williamsburg and what our city can become now and into the future. It's a spirit of cooperation and calibration that's brought the cooperation and collaboration that's brought the community together. In the span of half of a decade, we're witnessing unification, not just of areas of town, but people and businesses. And it's a wonderful thing when businesses find common ground to produce products and events that bring people together to experience more of what Williamsburg has to offer. And he feels we're on the verge of being the next big thing, and I do too. The people don't just visit for the history, but they stay for the culture. And we've worked hard to create an environment for our businesses and to help change the landscape of Williamsburg. And so I feel like it's our time to step up and to help them. Tourism is the lifeblood of Williamsburg, but it's more than the attractions. We really need to have the businesses here, as Vice Mayor Pons and other members of council have said, because that's what people are going to come back for. We create a lot of new dining, entertainment, and retail options, and this is a way that we can step up along with our major stakeholders to support them and be sure they not only survive, but hopefully thrive in the future. So I'm in support of this. And I would like to just say that I applaud the EDA, particularly Michele and her staff for all that's being done, not just on this program, but constant updates to the business community, and also to Laura and what she's done and what she will do. And to remember that come the end of August, if there are funds available, then we can perhaps look at other ways that we might be able to assist different levels of businesses and other groups in the community, and or keep it in the TDF for our tourism infrastructure and product. So that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to thank Drew for the side-by-side comparison of the budget forward that we actually saw and endorsed at our last council meeting with the three buckets: the CIP savings, the TDF fund, and then the last resort, the reserve, and showing how we've pivoted to help the businesses and what that effect is on especially the reserve. I thought that was very helpful, even if there was no music to it, Drew. The second thing is I'd like to thank the staff for the collaboration among departments and with city council individual members in terms of taking our input and coming up with a program that is very simple to administer and does not really have any need for subjectivity. It's all objective in terms of the criteria. So I think that's been very good, and I support the program.
And I'd just like to add, Mr. Trivette and Mr. Pons both mentioned that we would not be able to disclose, or we won't even have access to the information, but there won't be any ability to disclose the specific grant that goes to any particular business. But when this is all said and done, we can certainly report collectively what the total grant disbursements were so that the community is aware of how the total amount of money that was used. Any other discussion?
Mayor, I just have one thing I'd like to say before you move on to a motion. I was looking at the version of the resolution that is online, and we did make a number of changes. I say we, but really I mean I made a number of changes based on the comments that were provided by the Commissioner of Revenue. There was one other change that needed to be made that obviously did not, I made the change but didn't upload to the system. And that was, we need to delete B2 under loss criteria. That section required a business to have deployed some form of social distancing and remained operating. And we felt like that was a requirement that just simply wasn't required. So we'd like to delete B2 in the adoption, in the version that gets adopted.
So I'll make a motion. I move that City Council adopt resolution number 20-08 with the editing of deleting B2 as drafted.
Second.
Mr. Maslin,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Freiling,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Zhang.
Aye.
Okay, that takes us to, this takes us to the last item for today under new business, which is consideration and adoption of Ordinance 20-04, temporarily moving the polling places for the Matoaka and Stryker voting precincts for the May 5th, 2020 City Council elections that will now be held on May 19th, 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Trivette?
Yes, so, obviously we have been following diligently the concern over being able to hold a safe election process that was scheduled for several localities throughout the Commonwealth to be May the 5th. Obviously, the General Assembly has taken it up, the governor has taken it up, and we now have a final date for the holding of that election. It will be May the 19th. The issue of safety, though, remains a concern even in May, even at that date. So after talking with our electoral board and the General Registrar Director of Elections, what we decided to do is to open up 2 bays of the Williamsburg Fire Station to allow drive-through voting. We really think allowing voters to stay in their car and having it all being done at one location allows us to maintain the safety of the voters and reduce the number of poll workers required, which will allow us to keep some of those folks safe as well. For the election itself, we have been working diligently on the actual plans, the orchestration of the vote. So voters will enter a voting queue essentially so that we can maintain some stacking of vehicles in case we have that number of voters. And that voting queue will begin in the last exit of the municipal building. And then you'll sort of stack up in line, and there will be poll workers helping you to decide which precinct you should be voting at and steering you in the right bay of the fire station based on that precinct. Once you're in the fire station, there will be 2 stops. The first stop will be to qualify you as a voter, and the second stop will be to cast your ballot. And then you'll exit back out onto Lafayette Street with the assistance of the Williamsburg Police Department, who will be handling traffic control for us. There will be ample signage to help you understand how to enter the queue. And we will be using poll workers that are in the least susceptible categories in terms of age demographics, as well as pre-existing conditions to COVID-19, as well as deploying all of the necessary personal protective equipment. So please don't be alarmed when you see poll workers wearing masks and gloves and disinfecting clipboards in between uses. They're just trying to protect both you and them. With all of that being said, of course, the city still urges all eligible voters to cast their vote absentee. All you have to do is request that ballot. It will be mailed to you. The registrar will even include a postage paid envelope so that you can return it. So it couldn't be any easier. And obviously that will be the safest way to cast your vote. So this resolution, or this ordinance, Mayor, 2004, is the necessary housekeeping required to actually move the polling places, the precincts, from the Stryker Center and the United Methodist Church to the fire station for this single election.
Questions for Mr. Trivette?
Just one question. I know that every election cycle, the electoral board, well, there's ongoing training for the electoral board as those who participate on polling on election day for training. I would assume that the electoral board and the staff at the registrar's office will be doing some training for those city employees that are volunteering.
That's right. The Director of Elections and I have talked about that extensively. We're going to be using primarily city staff as poll workers. So we do have a good sense of who those folks will be. And over the next 2 weeks, we will be getting them through the required training that the state provides to be poll workers.
Good, good. Thank you. No other questions.
Drew, thank you for planning this and putting all options on the table to ensure that voters can safely participate in the democratic exercise that we all should be doing, by the way. My question is, would this be kind of a test run to see if it could be replicated for the June primaries, or is this just going to be limited to the May election?
Well, right now, we think it's just limited to the May election. But before I get too far into my answer, I do want to say that the credit for this really goes to the Electoral Board and the Director of Elections, Tina Reitzel. But I think that what we will be doing, of course, is learning from what happens on Election Day, May the 19th. If it goes well, and I have every reason to think that it will, it's very possible that this gets used as part of the primary plan too. I think it just depends upon what phase of Virginia Forward, the reopening plan produced by the governor, we are in, as well as rates of infection that still exist in the community.
Thank you for that. One final question for folks who aren't tuning in or aren't social media savvy or don't receive emails. How is staff going to ensure that voters don't turn up to the normal Stryker and Matoaka precincts, and to redirect them to the fire station.
Yeah, we are trying to enlist more volunteers, quote unquote, poll workers, even though some of them won't actually be working the polls, so that we can do some directions at those locations. At the very least, there will be signage directing you to the new polling place, the fire station. Luckily, the city of Williamsburg is small enough geographically that even if you showed up at the United Methodist Church, it's not that much of a hardship to continue your journey down to the fire station.
That's right. Well, echoing your remarks earlier before, I'd like to personally thank the electoral board and Tina and Haley for their leadership on this effort and ensuring that we have safe voting. Thank you.
I don't have any questions. I just have a couple comments. One that goes to Mr. Zhang's question about communication. I thought that the news release that came out yesterday about the different options and ways to vote was very good. And I'm assuming that that's on the website for individuals to check and not only get the information, but the links are there where one can click in and get additional details. And I, for one, did curbside voting yesterday and found it a very easy process to do. I called Haley and she came out and brought me the ballot, and it was covered. There was after I made my marks, there was a way to keep it covered, and then she took it into the building, and there was no line or wait, and she was very accommodating. So I want to put forth that option as well, and I believe that is available through May 16th, if I'm correct in that. So just another way for people to get out and exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, Drew, I requested maybe a video of the concierge curbside voting. I think we missed an opportunity yesterday with Barbara. That would have been great.
I have a couple photos.
Yeah, following up on Benny's comment or question, I'm not sure how many people actually use our bus system, WADA, to actually to vote, but it would be good to get a communication campaign with WADA. That's all I had.
Sure, we're happy to talk to WADA about that.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the ability to request an absentee ballot online is very simple. So much so that I was able to do it, and other family members have done it, and it comes very quickly. I'd just like to remind people and emphasize what Mr. Trivette said, that we absolutely are encouraging everybody who possibly can to vote by absentee ballot. There is no special requirement. There are instructions online, or if you mail in, that tell you how to fill out the form in relation to the COVID-19 issue that's causing this need. So if everybody could do that, it would be terrific. May 12th is the last day to request an absentee ballot by mail or online. As Ms. Ramsey said, May 16th is the last day for in-person absentee voting at the voter registrar's office. It's important to note that is a Saturday, but they will be open on that Saturday, the 16th, from 8 until 4:30. So we encourage everybody to take advantage of this who is able. Any other discussion, or do we have a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move that City Council approve ordinance number 20-04 as drafted.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Freiling,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Zhang.
Aye.
That concludes our business for today and takes us to open forum. I'm assuming, Mr. Trivette and Ms. Felico, that we do not have any previously submitted comments to be read into the record.
That's correct.
Okay, do we have anybody? Nobody's on the line waiting? Give it just another couple of seconds here. Seeing no calls or hearing no calls come through, we'll close the open forum. Any other business from any council member?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Uh,
No.
You looked anxious, Ms. Ramsey.
No?
And do I hear a motion?
I move to adjourn.
Second?
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Fryling,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Mr. Zhang.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.